So there I was, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, Mac to anyone who doesn't want their coffee spilled on their fancy uniform, drifting through space in what could generously be called a cargo hauler and more accurately described as a flying scrap heap held together by duct tape and sheer stubbornness. The rusty bolt had been making weird noises for the past 3 parsecs, which in my experience meant either the hyperdrive was about to explode or we were about to meet some very unfriendly aliens. Turns out it was option 3, total engine failure above a planet that looked like someone had taken Earth and forgotten to add the fun parts. Xerion 7, according to my nav computer, was classified as marginally habitable with indigenous wildlife, which in galactic bureaucrat speak translates to, we haven't bothered to check if anything important lives there. The emergency landing was about as smooth as a brick through a window, and I'd barely finished running diagnostics when my proximity sensors started screaming about incoming ships. That's when I met the Vortakians, and let me tell you, if you've ever wondered what would happen if accountants evolved opposable thumbs in starships, wonder no more. They looked like 7-foot-tall praying mantises that had been dressed by the galaxy's most boring fashion designer. All identical gray uniforms with more medals than a Soviet general and attitudes that could freeze helium. Their leader, who introduced himself with the kind of pompous flourish usually reserved for declaring war, was Administrator Quibblenox. Yes, that was actually his name, I checked, twice. He had the personality of a tax audit and the charm of a root canal, speaking in the monotone voice of someone who had never experienced joy and was personally offended by the concept. "Human vessel," he announced through my comm system without so much as a hello. "You have violated Airspace Regulation 47-Gamma by conducting an unauthorized atmospheric breach. Please prepare for immediate inspection and possible citation." I looked around my cockpit, which was currently held together by prayer and spite, then back at his pristine formation of ships that probably cost more than my entire planet's GDP. "Yeah, about that," I replied, trying to keep the sarcasm to a minimum and failing spectacularly. "My ship decided to take an unscheduled nap, so unless you've got some jumper cables that work on quantum drives, I'm gonna be here for a while." Turns out the Vortakians were conducting what they called a comprehensive wildlife assessment and optimization protocol, which sounded official and important until you realized it meant they were basically playing God with an entire planet's ecosystem. They'd been cataloging every living thing on Xerion 7 for months, determining which species were resource efficient, and which ones were, in their clinical terminology, expandable biological redundancies. In other words, they were deciding which animals got to live and which ones got to die, all based on some cosmic spreadsheet that probably factored in things like tourism potential and mining rights. And the kicker? They were proud of it. Quibblenox explained their methodology with the enthusiasm of someone describing their favorite hobby, completely oblivious to the fact that he was basically admitting to planning genocide with a clipboard. As I listened to him drone on about optimal resource allocation and sustainable ecosystem management, one thought kept running through my head. These guys had clearly never met a human before, because if they had, they'd know that we have this annoying habit of refusing to mind our own business, especially when someone's trying to play judge, jury, and executioner with a bunch of defenseless animals. But I smiled and nodded, because sometimes the best way to deal with bureaucrats is to let them think they're in charge, while you figure out how to completely ruin their day. After 3 hours of listening to Quibblenox explain their optimization protocols with the enthusiasm of a mortician discussing his favorite corpses, I finally managed to escape his lecture by claiming I needed to assess damage to my ship. What I actually needed was to get away before I said something that would get me vaporized by their fancy death rays. I was trudging through what the Vortakians had classified as Sector 7 Delta, minimal biological value, which was their polite way of saying ugly rocks nobody cares about, when I heard it. A low whimpering sound coming from a cave system that looked like nature's attempt at abstract art. Now, I'm not exactly Dr. Dolittle, but even I could tell the difference between "I'm happy" noises and "please don't let me die alone" noises. The cave was deeper than it looked, and darker than my ex-wife's sense of humor. But there, huddled in a corner, like she was trying to disappear into the rock itself, was the most pathetic sight I'd seen since my last performance review. A wolf-like creature, about the size of a German shepherd, but with fur that shifted colors like oil on water, was barely breathing. 3 tiny cubs, no bigger than house cats, were pressed against her side, making sounds that could break a heart made of titanium. "Well, hell," I muttered, because sometimes profound moments call for profound vocabulary. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, followed by the kind of throat clearing that usually precedes bad news. I turned to find Quibblenox flanked by what appeared to be a human in a lab coat, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. "Ah, Captain Rodriguez," Quibblenock said with the tone of someone who'd just caught a kid with his hand in the cookie jar. "I see you've discovered specimen designation Zirian Wolf Prime 7743. She has been marked for natural elimination due to severe injury sustained in what your species would emotionally classify as a territorial dispute with a human." Dr. Pip Thornberry, according to her name tag, shifted nervously and avoided eye contact like she was afraid I might be contagious. She was probably in her 30s, with the kind of messy hair that said "I love science more than personal grooming," and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and couldn't unsee any of it. "Natural elimination," I repeated slowly, the way you might repeat instructions for defusing a bomb. "You mean you're just gonna let her die?" "Correct," Quibblenox replied, with the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a particularly challenging math problem. "Medical intervention would require resource allocation that exceeds the specimen's projected ecological contribution index. It is, as you humans say, not cost-effusive." I looked at the wolf. Luna, I decided to call her, because she deserved a name better than a filing system designation, then at her cubs. They were looking at me with the kind of trust that could make a grown man weep, which was inconvenient since I had a reputation to maintain. "What about the cubs?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I didn't want to hear the answer. Dr. Thornberry opened her mouth like she was about to say something, then snapped it shut when Quibblenox gave her a look that could have frozen lava. "The offspring are classified as dependent biological redundancies," he explained with the clinical precision of a surgeon removing an appendix. "Without the maternal unit, their survival probability drops to negligible percentages. Nature will resolve the situation efficiently." That's when something inside my head made a noise like a circuit breaker flipping. Maybe it was the way Luna looked at me, like she knew exactly what these bureaucratic buzzards were planning. Maybe it was the cubs, who I immediately dubbed chaos, mayhem, and trouble, based on the way they were already trying to climb my boots despite everything. Or maybe it was just the fact that I'd spent most of my adult life hauling cargo for people who treated living beings like line items on a balance sheet. "Well," I said, kneeling down and letting trouble, the smallest cub, sniff my fingers. "That's where we disagree, Administrator. See, I've got this character flaw where I don't like watching things die just because it's convenient for someone's spreadsheet." The Quibblenox made a noise like a computer processing an error message. "I fail to comprehend your meaning, Captain. The decision has been made based on optimal resource distribution algorithms. Emotional responses are not factored into our assessment protocols." I stood up, careful not to disturb the cubs, and gave him my best smile, the one that had gotten me out of trouble in 12 star systems and into trouble in twice as many. "Yeah, about that. I think you're about to get a crash course in Human Resource Management 101. And trust me, we wrote the book on being unreasonable." The next morning, I marched into the Vortakian Temporary Administrative Complex, which looked like someone had taken a DMV office and launched it into space, with the kind of determination usually reserved for storming beaches or asking for raises. My plan was simple. Get medical supplies, save Luna and the cubs, and maybe teach these clipboard-wielding accountants what real efficiency looked like. I should have known it wouldn't be that easy. The first person I met was Lieutenant Buzz Grimaldi, a human military liaison who looked like he'd been assembled from spare marine parts and programmed with every regulation manual ever written. Buzz was the kind of guy who probably folded his underwear in alphabetical order and considered Casual Friday a threat to galactic security. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, consulting a tablet that probably contained more rules than the galactic tax code, "I understand you're requesting access to emergency medical supplies for unauthorized veterinary intervention on protected planetary specimens." "That's one way to put it," I replied, trying to keep my voice level. "Another way would be to say I want to save some animals that these bugnoid bureaucrats are planning to murder with paperwork." Buzz's eye twitched. For just a second, something that might have been human compassion flickered across his face before military training steamrolled it back into submission. "I'm afraid that would require Form 847B, Application for Unauthorized Emotional Attachment to Non-Sentient Life Forms, cross-referenced with Permit 23 Alpha for Off-World Medical Supply Requisition, and signed approval from the Xenobiological Ethics Committee." I stared at him. "You made at least half of those up." "Actually," said a voice behind me, "they're all real. I helped write Form 847B. I turned to find Dr. Pip Thornberry looking like she wanted to crawl under a rock and stay there until the heat death of the universe. She was clutching a coffee mug that read, "Galaxy's okayest scientist," and vibrating with enough nervous energy to power a small starship. "Dr. Thornberry," I said, trying to sound friendly instead of completely exasperated, "please tell me you've got some good news about medical supplies." She glanced around like she was afraid the walls had ears, then leaned in closer. "I might have access to some basic medical equipment," she whispered, "but Quibbleox has classified all veterinary supplies as restricted materials. He's convinced you're going to start some kind of interspecies revolution." "A revolution?" I laughed. "I just want to keep a wolf and her babies from dying. If that's revolutionary, then this galaxy needs better revolutions." That's when Quibbleox himself appeared, materializing like a bad rash, with the timing of someone who'd been eavesdropping for fun and profit. "Captain Rodriguez," he announced in his funeral director voice. "I have been reviewing your request for medical intervention supplies, and I regret to inform you that your application has been denied, pending further review by the Interspecies Wildlife Management Subcommittee." "Let me guess," I said. "The subcommittee meets once every never, and they're currently booked solid until the next ice age?" "The subcommittee convenes every third lunar cycle of the Vortaki calendar year," he replied with the satisfaction of someone delivering particularly devastating news. "Their next scheduled meeting is in approximately 4 standard months. Of course, you could appeal this decision by filing Form 1138C, but that requires sponsorship from a certified xenobiological ethics officer, and I'm afraid Dr. Thornberry's certification expired last week." Dr. Thornberry made a strangled noise that sounded like she was choking on her own despair. "I forgot to renew it," she whispered. "I've been so busy cataloging species for the optimization project that I completely forgot about the paperwork." Buzz was studying his tablet with the intensity of someone trying to decode the meaning of life. "There might be another way," he said slowly, like he was afraid the words would get him court-martialed. "Emergency Protocol 7 allows for immediate medical supply distribution in cases of, quote, imminent threat to galactic peace and security, unquote." Quibblenuck's head swiveled toward Buzz with mechanical precision. "Lieutenant Grimaldi, I fail to see how the natural elimination of one specimen could constitute a threat to galactic security." I grinned. "Sometimes the universe hands you exactly the opening you need." "Well, Administrator, here's the thing about humans. We're pack animals, just like Luna and her cubs. And when someone threatens our pack, or any pack we've decided to adopt, we tend to get unreasonable. Very unreasonable. The kind of unreasonable that starts with angry letters to senators and ends with viral hologram videos that make your entire species look like monsters to every civilized world in the galaxy." The color drained from Quibblenuck's face, or at least I think it did. It was hard to tell with someone who already looked like a walking corpse in a business suit. "You would not dare to create such a public relations disaster." "Try me," I said, pulling out my personal recorder. "I've already got some great footage of you explaining how letting a mother die in front of her babies is peak efficiency. I'm thinking the title will be something catchy, like Aliens Let Wolf Family Die Because Math Says So, or maybe Vortakians, Why Compassion is Bad for Business." Dr. Thornberry was staring at me like I'd just announced my intention to punch a black hole in the face. Buzz was trying very hard to hide what looked suspiciously like a smile, and Quibbleox was making the kind of calculating expression that usually preceded either surrender or thermonuclear war. "Perhaps," he said finally, "there might be some room for administrative flexibility in this matter. Dr. Thornberg, please prepare a revised assessment of the specimen's ecological contribution potential. Lieutenant Grimaldi, initiate Emergency Protocol 7 documentation. I will personally review all materials for compliance with regulations." As they scattered to do his bidding, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best way to beat bureaucracy is to threaten it with something it fears more than inefficiency: bad publicity. Now I just had to figure out how to actually save Luna before she ran out of time. While Quibbleox was busy drowning in his own bureaucratic quicksand, I was back in my ship's cargo bay, having what you might generously call a creative engineering moment, or what my insurance company would probably classify as catastrophic disregard for manufacturer warranties. The rusty bolt wasn't much to look at, but she was loaded with enough spare parts and random junk to build a small space station. Or, as I was about to prove, a fully functional veterinary clinic. I'd hauled everything from mining equipment to luxury kitchen appliances across half the galaxy. And if there's one thing you learn in the cargo business, it's that everything is eventually useful for something completely different than what it was designed for. That hydroponic nutrient pump? Perfect for IV fluid administration. Those environmental suit air scrubbers? Excellent for creating a sterile surgical environment. The deluxe food synthesizer I was supposed to deliver to some fancy restaurant on Centauri Prime? Well, it turns out molecular reconstruction technology works just as well on antibiotics as it does on souffle. Captain Rodriguez, came Dr. Thornburg's voice from the cargo bay entrance, followed by the sound of someone trying very hard not to hyperventilate. What exactly are you doing to that poor food processor? I looked up from where I was elbow-deep in circuitry, holding a plasma torch in one hand and what used to be a coffee maker in the other. I'm performing what we in the technical field call aggressive technological repurposing, I explained, trying to sound more confident than I felt. This beauty is about to become the galaxy's first jury-rigged medical synthesizer, capable of producing everything from broad-spectrum antibiotics to surgical nanobots. Pip stared at my rapidly expanding collection of cannibalized appliances with the expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. You're building medical equipment out of kitchen gadgets and mining tools, she said, her voice climbing toward panic territory. That's insane. That's impossible. That's... Tuesday, I finished, connecting the nutrient pump to what used to be a high-end espresso machine. Look, Doc, I've been fixing impossible problems with inadequate resources since before your species figured out space travel. The trick is to stop thinking about what something is supposed to do and start thinking about what it actually does. That's when Buzz appeared in the doorway, looking like he was torn between reporting me to his superiors and asking for lessons in creative insubordination. Captain, he said carefully, I've managed to accidentally leave a supply crate outside the restricted materials storage facility. It would be a real shame if someone were to accidentally take it before the automated security system accidentally reactivates in about 20 minutes. I grinned at him. Lieutenant, I'm starting to think there's hope for you yet. I wouldn't know what you mean, he replied with the kind of straight face that would make a professional poker player weep with envy. I'm just following standard protocol for equipment that's been accidentally misplaced due to clerical errors that I definitely didn't cause on purpose. While Buzz was delivering his masterclass in plausible deniability, Pip had wandered over to examine my makeshift medical setup with the fascination of someone watching a magic trick she couldn't quite figure out. This is actually brilliant, she murmured, running her fingers along the improvised surgical table I'd constructed from a cargo loading platform and some shock-absorbing foam. The nutrient delivery system you've rigged up could provide more precise dosing than anything in our official medical kit. Finally, I said, wiping grease off my hands with a rag that had seen better decades, someone who appreciates genuine craftsmanship. Now here's what I need from you, Doc. I can build the hardware, but I need someone who actually knows which end of a medical tricorder is which to help me calibrate everything. Pip's face went through about 6 different expressions before settling on determined resignation. Officially, I can't help you with unauthorized medical procedures on classified specimens, she said, then pulled a scanner from her lab coat with the kind of smile that suggested she'd found her backbone. Unofficially, I didn't become a xenobiologist to watch animals die because some administrator thinks compassion is inefficient. The next few hours were a blur of technical jury-rigging, creative swearing, and the kind of teamwork that happens when people decide to throw caution to the wind and see what's on the other side. Buzz kept us supplied with accidentally misplaced equipment while maintaining perfect military composure. Pip provided the scientific expertise to turn my chaotic collection of repurposed machinery into something that might actually work without killing anyone. And I did what I do best, making the impossible merely improbable through sheer stubborn determination. By the time we were ready to head back to Luna's cave, I'd created what was either a medical miracle or the galaxy's most expensive way to accidentally commit malpractice. The whole contraption looked like someone had crossed a food truck with a surgical suite and powered it with spare parts from a junkyard, but according to Pip's readings, it should be capable of treating everything from internal bleeding to systemic infection. You know, Pip said as we loaded the equipment onto an anti-grav cart, in all my years of studying xenobiology, I never thought I'd be sneaking around my own research station to provide unauthorized medical care using kitchen appliances. Life's funny that way, I replied, checking the power cells on what used to be a deluxe sandwich press and was now a portable surgical laser. One day you're following regulations and filing reports, the next day you're part of an interspecies medical revolution powered by repurposed coffee makers. Buzz appeared beside us, somehow managing to look completely innocent while clearly being up to his eyeballs in conspiracy. I've taken the liberty of creating a diversion, he announced. It seems Administrator Quibblenocks has received an urgent communication requiring his immediate attention in the eastern quadrant of the research zone. He should be occupied for at least 2 hours investigating reports of unauthorized atmospheric disturbances. Atmospheric disturbances? I asked. Buzz's expression remained perfectly neutral. It appears someone accidentally activated a weather modification drone. These things happen when you have complicated equipment and tired operators who might push the wrong buttons due to fatigue from processing excessive paperwork. As we made our way through the twilight toward Luna's cave, I couldn't help but reflect on the beautiful irony of the situation. Here were two humans and a reformed military bureaucrat sneaking around an alien research station with jury-rigged medical equipment, all to save a wolf and her cubs from death by administrative efficiency. If this wasn't the most perfectly human response to cosmic bureaucracy, I didn't know what was. Luna was exactly where we'd left her, though she looked weaker than before. The cubs were huddled closer to her now, sensing that something was wrong with their world. When they saw us approaching with our bizarre collection of humming, beeping machinery, Chaos, the bravest of the three, actually took a few steps toward us before retreating to his mother's side. "Okay," I said, kneeling down beside Luna and letting her sniff my hand. "Let's see if human ingenuity can beat alien efficiency. Time to find out if a space trucker, a nervous scientist, and a military liaison with a conscience could pull off the galaxy's most unauthorized veterinary procedure." The procedure had been going beautifully for exactly 47 minutes, when everything went straight to hell in a handbasket made of bureaucratic red tape and alien superiority complexes. Luna was responding better than we'd dared hope. Her breathing had stabilized, the internal bleeding had stopped, and she'd even managed to lift her head to check on her cubs. Chaos, mayhem, and trouble were cautiously exploring the cave entrance, displaying the kind of curiosity that only comes with returning confidence in their mother's recovery. That's when the sound of approaching hover vehicles shattered our temporary peace like a brick through a cathedral window. "Well," I muttered, watching a formation of official Vortakian enforcement craft descend toward the cave like mechanical vultures. I was wondering when the other shoe would drop. Looks like it brought friends and a warrant. Bibbleknock's voice boomed from the lead vehicle's external speakers with all the warmth of a funeral announcement. "Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Thornberry, and Lieutenant Grimaldi, you are in violation of Interplanetary Wildlife Protection Act Section 847, subsection J, paragraph 14. Unauthorized medical intervention on classified biological specimens. Please step away from the specimens immediately and prepare for administrative processing." Pip went pale as a sheet and started making the kind of whimpering sounds usually associated with small animals facing large predators. "We're dead," she whispered. "They're going to revoke my license, ban me from all research facilities, and probably exile me to some mining colony where the only thing to study is rock formations and regret." Buzz, meanwhile, had gone into full military mode, positioning himself between us and the approaching vehicles, with the kind of stance that suggested he was mentally calculating firing angles and escape routes. "Captain," he said without taking his eyes off the enforcement team, "I should inform you that resisting Vortakian administrative enforcement carries a penalty of up to 15 years in a bureaucratic rehabilitation facility, where they make you file the same form in triplicate every day until you achieve enlightenment or a complete mental breakdown, whichever comes first." "Thanks for the pep talk, Lieutenant," I replied, gently stroking Luna's head while she watched the approaching officials with the intelligent wariness of a creature who'd learned not to trust beings in uniforms. "But here's the thing about humans. We're really, really bad at knowing when to quit." The enforcement vehicles landed in a formation that would have made a chess master weep with appreciation, disgorging a small army of uniformed Vortakians who moved with the precision of synchronized swimmers and the enthusiasm of tax auditors. Quibbleknox emerged from the lead craft wearing what appeared to be an even more elaborate version of his usual uniform, complete with enough medals and insignia to stock a military surplus store. "Captain Rodriguez," he announced with the theatrical flair of someone delivering a death sentence, "you have engaged in flagrant disregard for established protocols, unauthorized use of restricted materials, and most seriously, the application of emotional decision-making in a scientific environment. I am here to personally oversee the correction of this administrative anomaly." I stood up slowly, making sure to keep myself between the Vortakians and Luna, who had managed to get to her feet with the kind of shaky determination that made my heart do things that definitely weren't regulation compliant. "Administrator," I said with my most winning smile, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. You see, I haven't violated any protocols." Quibbleknox made a sound like a computer trying to process a logic error. "I have documented evidence of your unauthorized medical interventions, your misappropriation of restricted supplies, and your blatant disregard for established specimen management procedures." "Aye," I said, pulling out a tablet that I'd spent the last 2 days loading with enough forms and documentation to choke a black hole. But, you see, I've been following proper procedures all along. According to Regulation 23B, subsection 7, any individual discovering a potentially endangered specimen has the right, no, the obligation, to file an emergency species preservation appeal, which I did. I handed him the tablet with the flourish of someone revealing a royal flush. Form 1847 Delta, filed in triplicate with cross-references to Environmental Protection Statute 4055C and Interspecies Ethical Treatment Guidelines Section 12, properly notarized, witnessed, and submitted through official channels exactly 48 hours ago. Quibblenox stared at the tablet like it had just insulted his mother. This is impossible. There are no provisions for individual citizens to file emergency species preservation appeals without prior authorization from the Xenobiological Ethics Committee. Actually, piped up Pip, who had apparently found her courage somewhere between panic and indignation, there are. I helped write that regulation 3 years ago. It was designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Bureaucratic delays that result in unnecessary species loss due to administrative inefficiency. Buzz stepped forward with the kind of smile that suggested he was enjoying this way more than military protocol probably allowed. And according to Military Liaison Regulation 688 Alpha, any emergency preservation appeal filed by a civilian contractor automatically receives temporary military protection, pending review. Which means, Administrator, that your enforcement action is currently in violation of approximately 12 different interagency cooperation protocols. I watched Quibblenook's face cycle through expressions, ranging from confusion to fury to the kind of dawning horror that comes with realizing you've been outmaneuvered by people you considered inferior. This is preposterous, he sputtered. You cannot simply manufacture legal justifications for your unauthorized actions. We're not manufacturing anything, I said, enjoying every second of his bureaucratic meltdown. We're using the exact same system you've been using to justify letting animals die. The only difference is, we're actually trying to save lives instead of crossing items off a cosmic to-do list. That's when Luna decided to make her own contribution to the conversation. She had been watching the exchange with the kind of intelligent attention that suggested she understood more than anyone gave her credit for, and apparently she'd decided that Quibblenox represented a threat to her newly recovered family. With a low growl that managed to convey both warning and promise, she positioned herself protectively in front of her cubs, who had responded to their mother's movement by forming their own little defensive line. The sight of a wolf and 3 cubs standing together against a squad of armed bureaucrats should have been pathetic. Instead, it was magnificent. Luna might have been injured and exhausted, but she was a mother protecting her babies, and that made her more dangerous than any weapon the Vortakians could bring to bear. You know what the really beautiful thing is about all this? I said, watching Chaos take a brave step forward to stand beside his mother. You came here to eliminate what you called biological redundancies. But what you've actually done is prove that compassion isn't inefficient. It's the most efficient force in the universe. It brings together humans and aliens, scientists and soldiers, cargo haulers and military liaisons, all working toward the same goal. Quibblenox was frantically consulting his own tablet, probably trying to find some regulation that would let him arrest us all for excessive optimism. This is not over, Captain Rodriguez. I will review every form, every procedure, every comma in your documentation, and when I find the inevitable errors, and I will find them, you will face the full consequences of your actions. Looking forward to it, I replied, scratching behind Luna's ears while she kept her eyes fixed on the administrator. But in the meantime, I suggest you and your enforcement team return to your base and start preparing for the media coverage. Because win or lose, this story is going galactic. And I don't think the Vortakian Tourism Board is going to appreciate being known as the species that tried to kill a family of space wolves for filing the wrong paperwork. As the enforcement team retreated to their vehicles with all the dignity they could muster, which wasn't much, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the best way to beat the system isn't to break it, but to use it so well that it breaks itself. The real victory, though, was watching Luna nuzzle her cubs while they played around her feet, alive and healthy and completely unaware that they'd just been at the center of an interspecies diplomatic incident. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones you fight for glory or principle, but the ones you fight simply because someone needs help and you're the only one stubborn enough to provide it. 3 months later, I was sitting in the captain's chair of the newly christened Rusty Bolt Sanctuary ship, watching Chaos attempt to operate the coffee maker while Mayhem had somehow managed to get herself tangled in the navigation cables, And Trouble was doing what he did best, living up to his name, by chewing on something that was definitely not meant to be chewed on. Luna, now fully recovered and sporting a coat that shimmered like liquid starlight when she moved, was supervising her offspring's chaos with the patient resignation of a mother who had given up on the concept of a quiet life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it sure hadn't happened without a fight that would go down in galactic bureaucratic history as either the most ridiculous or most inspiring administrative battle ever waged, depending on which species you asked. Quibblenux had spent exactly 17 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes reviewing every form, regulation, and subsection I'd filed, looking for the smoking gun that would let him drag me off to whatever passes for jail in Vortakian society. What he found instead was what can only be described as a bureaucratic masterpiece. A web of properly filed paperwork so complex and thorough that it actually created legal precedent for establishing private wildlife sanctuaries on previously uncharted worlds. Turns out that when you combine human stubbornness with 3 days of intensive research into alien legal codes, you can accomplish things that even the aliens didn't know were possible. Who knew that subsection 447C of the Interplanetary Commerce Code, when cross-referenced with Environmental Protection Statute 23B and filed under the right lunar phase, actually grants individuals the right to claim abandoned or economically non-viable territories for humanitarian purposes? The Vortakians certainly didn't, which made Quibblenux's final report a thing of bitter beauty. He'd been forced to officially recognize my claim to a 12-square-kilometer section of Zerion 7 as a legitimate wildlife sanctuary, complete with all the legal protections and government subsidies that came with it. The look on his face when he handed over the certification documents was worth every sleepless night I'd spent cross-referencing regulations. But the real victory came in watching the team that had formed around this whole ridiculous adventure decide to stick together. Dr. Pip Thornberry had submitted her resignation from the Vortakian research program the day after our showdown, citing irreconcilable differences with administrative policy regarding the value of individual life. When I offered her the position of Chief Xenobiological Officer for the newly established Rodriguez Wildlife Sanctuary, she accepted so fast I'm pretty sure she broke some kind of land speed record. Lieutenant Buzz Grimaldi's transformation was even more dramatic. The man who had started out as a walking regulation manual had discovered that there's a big difference between following orders and doing what's right. His voluntary transfer to serve as security liaison for civilian humanitarian operations was approved with suspicious speed, which suggested that his superiors were either very understanding or very eager to get rid of someone who had developed inconvenient ideas about compassion. The sanctuary had become something none of us had originally planned. A rest stop for travelers, a research station for studying interspecies cooperation, and most importantly, a place where the galaxy's unwanted and abandoned creatures could find safety. We'd rescued everything from injured cargo haulers to lost colony ships, and somehow turned a broken-down freighter and a patch of wilderness into something that actually mattered. Luna had appointed herself head of security, which mostly involved her following me around the ship and giving suspicious looks to anyone who seemed like they might be carrying paperwork. The cubs had grown into adolescents, with personalities as distinct as their names suggested. Chaos had developed an unhealthy interest in the ship's systems, and could usually be found trying to improve something that had been working perfectly fine. Mayhem had discovered that she could open any door, cabinet, or storage container on the ship, and considered this a personal challenge to explore everything. And Trouble had mastered the art of looking innocent while being absolutely, completely guilty of whatever had just gone wrong. "You know what the funny thing is?" Pip said, appearing at my shoulder with a cup of coffee and a datapad full of the day's reports. She'd traded her nervous energy for something that looked suspiciously like happiness, and the change was striking. 6 months ago, I was filing reports about the optimal elimination of redundant biological resources. Today, I'm watching 3 space wolves teach a cargo computer how to play fetch. I looked over at where Trouble was dropping a rubber ball into the ship's recycling chute, and waiting for it to be sorted and returned through the pneumatic delivery system. The fact that this actually worked was either a testament to the ship's advanced AI, or evidence that the universe had a sense of humor. "Life's funny that way," I said, taking the coffee and savoring the fact that it actually tasted like coffee instead of recycled engine coolant. You spend so much time following procedures that you forget why the procedures existed in the first place. Buzz appeared from the direction of the communications array, looking like someone who had just received news that could be either very good or very bad. "Captain," he announced in his official voice, though the slight smile around his eyes suggested it was probably good news, "we've received a priority communication from the Galactic Wildlife Protection Agency. It seems our little operation has attracted some attention. The message was from Director Hana Okafor, a woman whose reputation for not tolerating bureaucratic nonsense was legendary throughout the civilized galaxy. She was offering us official recognition as a certified interspecies wildlife sanctuary, complete with funding, legal protection, and, most importantly, the authority to expand our operations to other worlds where administrative efficiency was being used as an excuse to abandon the helpless. "So," I said, watching Luna sprawl across the deck while her cubs used her as a combination jungle gym and pillow, "it looks like we're going legitimate. Think we can handle being respectable?" "Not a chance," Pitt replied, grinning as Chaos managed to activate the ship's external speakers and filled the cargo bay with what sounded like whale songs crossed with elevator music. "But I figure if we're going to be irresponsible, we might as well be irresponsible on a galactic scale. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how a broken-down cargo hauler, a wolf named Luna, and 3 cubs named after concepts of disorder managed to prove something that every human knows, but most of the galaxy had forgotten. That sometimes the most efficient thing you can do is refuse to be efficient at all. Sometimes the most logical response to a cold, calculating universe is to be completely, stubbornly, magnificently illogical. Because at the end of the day, when bureaucrats and administrators and efficiency experts have finished optimizing and streamlining and reducing everything to numbers on a spreadsheet, someone has to be willing to look at a dying wolf and her cubs and say, "Not on my watch." And if that someone happens to be human, well, that's just the way we're built. We don't abandon pack. We don't leave family behind. And we absolutely, positively, refuse to let accountants decide who gets to live and who gets to die, even if those accountants happen to have spaceships and advanced technology and more regulations than anyone should ever have to read. Especially then. The rusty bolt might not be much to look at, but she's home to a pack that includes humans, wolves, and one very determined former military bureaucrat, who's discovered that breaking rules for the right reasons is infinitely more satisfying than following them for the wrong ones. And somewhere in the galaxy there's probably another administrator Quibblenox, discovering that human stubbornness is the one force in the universe that no amount of paperwork can contain. Good luck with that.